Hello.
The host has unmuted my mic.
I've unmuted you.
Oh,
It's
that's
showtime.
so you're responsible for what happens after you unmute me. You know this. We do a podcast together, Jean.
I know. And as you said last night, I can't rely on editing to edit you.
to clean me up. Oh my gosh.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. This is Tuesday night, the second night of our GEEK week, which is GEEK's annual fundraiser. And I'm very excited because along with myself, which is, I don't know what's going to happen. I'm a little tired today, but we've also got Dr. Christine B. Whelan and Dr. Glenn Patrick Doyle, who they are our resident self-help geeks. They're both board members of Seek Safely, and both have a long background in the self-help world in various ways. Dr. Christine, would you mind introducing yourself a little bit and explaining kind of where your interest in self-help comes from and why we would consider you a self-help geek?
So when I was in graduate school, I needed a topic for my doctoral dissertation. So I did what any good graduate student would do. I wandered around bookstores and libraries, and I noticed a really peculiar thing. Everybody seemed to sort of furtively go into the self-help aisles and like look left and look right and make sure nobody saw them, and then grab a book. And men would be grabbing books on, how to get a date or how to be better in bed. And then they would run over to the car mechanics and the economics section and go read it. I saw women who would, get a book like Codependent No More and sit right down in the middle of the self-help aisle, start reading and start crying. I mean, I saw it all. And so I kind of just sat in a big easy chair in the library. I was actually in a bookstore, and I just watched for a while. And I thought, you know what? There has got to be something here. And I learned that most academics didn't take self-help seriously because they thought these were popular books. They weren't well researched. They were, fads. And so most of my colleagues kind of looked down their nose at them. But I was totally fascinated because I realized that these were books that were changing the lives of millions of people. These were books that were inspiring the catchphrases for generations. And most of the academy wasn't going to take them seriously. That left me with an awesome topic for a doctoral dissertation. So I did my doctoral dissertation at Oxford on self-help books, specifically from 1950 to 2000. But I looked at the whole long history of self-help, and I compiled one of the first ever sort of databases of the number of self-help books in print in any particular year. I did that by literally counting the titles of self-help books in print in these old bound volumes, because at that point there were no online databases. And from there, I just really lost myself in the world of self-help, so much so that Jean and Dr. Glenn, I brought a stack of books with me right here.
I love it.
My favorites, because I purchased all of the old and original copies of so many of these self-help books that I researched. So, in case we really want to geek out and go directly to the source, I got them right here.
Okay, perfect. I think your self-help geek authority is well established.
Woo!
Certified geek.
Certified geek.
Totally.
I love it. Okay. Dr. Glenn, you want to give us the brief rundown of your why we can consider you an authority or a geek in self-help?
Now, Jean, why do you always have to say brief? Why, when I start to talk?
Because I went too long. That's why.
Oh, I don't think that's it.
That's a good answer, Christine. But
Christine, I think Jean has enough experience with me to know that you gotta throw it in there. People know my story really well and are probably sick of hearing it. But the short version is I too was wandering around bookstores. For me, it was when I was a teenager, a desperately depressed, almost suicidal teenager, because I was looking for something to help me feel moderately better. Um, and I was the guy who had no shame about hanging out in the self-help section. Not because I was like some healthy masculinity guy. It was more I was so like just depressed and desperate, and why would anything matter? So I started reading self-help books. But even before then, I mean, I remember when I was like, I have a memory of being in 6th or 7th grade. Like, I know I've told this story before, but and thinking of all the things that made up a human, of all the things that made up me in terms of physical characteristics, personality characteristics, blah, blah, blah. I made a list in my notebook of all the things that make up a human and how they could change. And I had this thought that if I just changed each one of these things little by little, day by day, sooner or later, I would arrive at being a whole new person. And if that's not like a self-help ethos, I don't know what it is. But anyway, yeah, I started reading self-help books. They gave me just enough mojo to stay alive, which was kind of important at the time. Still is kind of important. But my self-help journey started when I was like, I talk about cliche. I saw a Tony Robbins infomercial. I saw one of like the late night ones with Fran Tarkenton. That one, if you guys are familiar with the Tony Robbins canon of late night infomercials. But that put it on my radar screen that maybe there were books, and I went to the bookstore and started reading. So that self-help has always been a big part of my journey. You know, as a psychologist, I specialize in trauma recovery and addiction recovery. And it's a staple of my philosophy that, look, recovery, the therapy work is one thing. Therapy is a tool of recovery. The recovery work is the work we do on our own. It's literally self-help. And it's very rare that somebody walks into my office not having read a self-help book or engaged with the self-help personality, used a self-help product. So, I mean, I think self-help is a real backbone of a lot of people's recovery. Mm-hmm. So I've read about, I tried to total it up. Christine, I don't know if you've ever done this, try to total up how many self-help books you've read. Like, you had to do it for your dissertation. By the way,
that's one of my questions.
Okay. Christine, that reminds me so you actually did the project, the dissertation.
Yeah.
I remember going to interview at grad school in 2001, and sitting down with the doc who would become my advisor, actually, who was going to interview me for grad school. And she said, "What would you like to do in the field?" It's a pretty standard question. And I said, "I want to write self-help books." And instead of being like, "Oh, that's interesting, self-help is a culturally important thing," she said, "Why?
Why?
Why would you want to do that?" So I had the idea. I actually ended up kind of giving it up because I couldn't kind of formulate, like, I became interested in trauma and eventually did my work on that. But I also couldn't formulate, like, how do you actually research this in a way that makes sense? So you, as always, way smarter than me, figured it out.
But it's so interesting, Dr. Doyle, that you should have done that in about 2001 or so, because that was just when the American Psychological Association was beginning to try to publish some guidelines for psychologists writing self-help books, because apparently so many psychologists were writing books that, in fact, were not up to the APA's guidance, that they were finally of a sort of there was like a discussion that was happening, and I think maybe that was a time that it was like kind of a much more critical discussion around self-help.
Mm-hmm.
You bet.
Yeah, because self-help books are, I mean, yeah, they're not academic, but they're not meant to be, because they're trying to reach, a consumer audience, and they need to have that sort of tone to them. So I can understand why the APA would get nervous when psychologists are writing books that are, not academic books.
Well, and the mental health establishment has always had a prickly relationship with self-help, because on the one hand, it's always been kind of gauche, as epitomized by my advisor's response to my idea. But by that same token, the little APA, the American Psychiatric Association, so there's the big APA, the American Psychological Association, has many more members than the American Psychiatric Association, which publishes the DSM 4 or 5, et cetera, et cetera. The little APA has had a keynote speaker, has had M. Scott Peck as a keynote speaker. M. Scott, this is a great story. M. Scott Peck M. Scott Peck writes one of the best self-help books of all time, the Road Less Traveled. Amazing self-help book. I recommend everybody read it. It's so good. It's so good. And then he writes he tries to capitalize it. He writes a bunch of other books, like Further Along the Road Less Traveled, and I'm all the way down the road less traveled. Like it's always some variant of the road. He never quite got there.
Got away from that title.
But anyway, yeah. So the little APA, the American Psychiatric Association, had him as like a keynote speaker for something at their convention or something. And homeboy gives a speech about how human evil, which he wrote a whole book about titled People of the Lie, and demonic possession, which he also wrote a book about titled Glimpses of the Devil, should be in the DSM. They should be diagnosable in the DSM. Like their psychospiritual conditions should be. And he proposed the whole thing. He proposed like diagnostic criteria. And you gotta think that, so M. Scott Peck was always he was always into this mystical Christianity thing, right? Like you see some of it in The Road Less Traveled, you see a lot of it in these other books, like In Search of Stones. This is one of my favorite books of his. A lot of this mystical Christianity stuff. And so you can imagine that the American Psychiatric Association is saying, well, man, we don't dig on these weird self-help ideas. However, he's kind of a big deal. Like we can get a lot of publicity if we have him here. So it's this prickly relationship that the mental health world has with self-help.
Yeah.
And 80% of this is probably a very old statistic. I think it's probably even higher, but 80% of psychologists have recommended a self-help book to their patients at some point or another in their treatment plan, right? I mean,
you bet. I'd be surprised if it was that low. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, that's interesting. All right. So let's start with that. What is a self-help? If you were talking to somebody who was maybe struggling with finding direction in their life, what's a self-help book that you would recommend?
So this first self-help book I always recommend to everybody is Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People, because it is practical. It is there you go.
It's on my desktop. It's on my desktop.
I love it. It's one of those books where you don't have to even be comfortable with the language of psychology and the therapeutic culture to resonate with it. It just makes sense. And it is, I think, in that way, a good kind of gateway self-help book, because it gives you practical tools that you can put into action. And it's written in a very readable form, even though it is almost 100 years old at this point, 90 years old. And so that's always the first one that I go to. But for inspiration, I mean, your boy Tony Robbins and Awaken the Giant Within. I mean, I know you got that one there too.
My favorite, my favorite self-help book, for real.
That's a classic for a reason.
But
all right, what about you, Dr. Doyle? What's on?
Right here too, Dr. Doyle.
So, my answer to that is it depends a lot on who's asking. How to Win Friends and Influence People, by the way, one of its strengths as a book is it's exceptionally readable and well organized, which some self-help books are actually not. So Dale Carnegie really broke it down into fundamental techniques in handling people and how to win someone to your way of thinking. And then there's a section on leadership. Like he really broke it down into like principles that you it's a very well constructed book. For a starter book, there is a little book by Dr. Nathaniel Branden. So those of you who tuned into my live stream last night on the Dr. Doyle page heard me talk about Nathaniel Branden. Nathaniel Branden was a psychologist, and he was one of the first guys to really write about self-esteem. He was also a lover of Ayn Rand, and they had a nasty split, and it was a big drama thing.
Yes.
You guys, someday we'll talk all about that. But so he wrote a memoir actually titled, this is not my recommendation, he wrote a memoir titled Judgment Day, My Years with Ayn Rand. That is full of the good stuff. It's fantastic. His ex-wife also wrote a book titled The Passion of Ayn Rand that is like their affair from her perspective. It's great. Go look at it. Go find it. Anyway, Nathaniel Branden wrote a book early on in his career called Honoring the Self. That is a really, it's not his longest book. I think his longest book, his most comprehensive book is titled The 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem. And that's kind of the go-to reference on his theory of self-esteem. But this idea of honoring the self, he also wrote a book titled The Disowned Self. That's, I think everybody, and they're not hard reads. He's an exceptionally readable writer. He's a lot like Scott Peck that way. But I think they're a great pair of books, The Disowned Self and Honoring the Self, for as kind of a starter pack on self-esteem. I don't recommend my boy Tony Robbins for beginners, because even though I think he's a really interesting guy, and I think he can be, I think Tony has a skill set that makes him a very marketable guy. Look at this book. It's a 600-page book.
Yeah.
Right? He's also in the vein of self-help guys, much like our friend James Arthur Ray, that he, let's say he is heavily influenced by a lot of other writers. That is to say, he borrows a lot. That is to say, he imports a lot of his ideas from other writers. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. However, I don't know if it's the best starter pack for somebody, just dipping their toe into self-help. I will say this, speaking of Tony, and then I'll move on. But speaking of Tony Robbins, he wrote a little book titled Notes from a Friend. He used to have a project called the Christmas Basket Brigade. He probably still does, where every year on Christmas or Thanksgiving or whatever, his organization, Robbins Research International, they go out and they deliver Christmas baskets, like baskets of food and necessities and stuff to economically disadvantaged folks and whatever. And he would stick this book, Notes from a Friend, was kind of like the bare bones essence of his shtick. And he would tuck these things into the Christmas baskets. So in addition to like getting food and stuff, they would get his like a primer on his shtick. Go out and read that book. That actually is a much more readable thing than 600-page Awaken the Giant Within.
So that's really interesting, because I think one of the strengths of Awaken the Giant Within is that it is 600 pages. And no, you're absolutely right. People are not going to read the whole thing. But when they purchase the book and it's big and thick and they believe that this actually, I'm going to read this and I'm going to change my life with this. And the heft of it, the commitment of it, I think may also help people. And yeah, I mean, most people do not get past chapter 3 of any self-help book. And so this is, of course, why then we buy so many, right? Because we want that sense that we are, in fact, making a credible commitment to behavioral change with the next book that we buy. You bet.
100%. I will say this for Awaken. So I mean, this is my favorite self-help book.
It is.
You can definitely tell the leap he made in communication skill between his first book, which is it's actually a really famous self-help book. His first foray was called Unlimited Power. It's this guy. And it basically regurgitates a lot of NLP. And you can really tell the leap he made between this book and this book. I find Awaken the Giant Within actually very readable. It's just so much. In my own experience, like most of the time when you're reading self-help books, you're pretty down and out.
Yep.
That it can be pretty intimidating. But that goes to the thing of like, well, it depends who's asking, right? Like, and it depends what they're struggling with, how verbal they are. Yeah.
I feel like what you were saying, Christine, about people buying the books, it's like there's some synergistic experience that combines the thrill and the high of shopping with the thrill and the high of taking a step towards self-improvement in the buying of the self-help book.
Yes, and it's gotten easier and easier, and the barrier to entry to get that boost has gotten lower and lower. So, for example, back in the day, you actually had to go to a bookstore and look somebody in the eye across the counter as the cashier rings you up for
And maybe somebody sitting in a big armchair who's just watching you.
exactly. Sorry. Exactly. So, these are the, so it was a much more public experience. Now you can buy it online on Amazon or any other online place, and it gets delivered to you in a brown box. Nobody ever knows. And so first, when you have that jolt of, I've done something, I've spent my money, I've made at least somewhat of a commitment to buying this book and maybe reading it or reading some of it. And then you have that hope that things are going to get better. And that hope is really, really valuable. Now, it's not just self-help books that do this. It's all sorts of products. I mean,
lottery tickets,
sure. But even things, I mean, anything on Instagram, under eye cream on Instagram. I mean, you name it. Like, I find these things and I logically know that it's not going to solve the problem. I know it's not. And yet I really want to buy it anyway. And depending on how tired I am and how bad of a day I had, sometimes I actually do buy it, even though I know it's not going to work, just to get that hope that it will.
You bet.
Yeah.
Dr. Doyle, you can take that apart. I'm sure that's not a good thing, is it?
Well, I can personally attest. So I have two thoughts. I can personally attest that the high of having bought a new self-help book is much like the high of having bought whatever that's going to improve your life, right? And it's that possibility. Like, the research suggests that when we get that dopamine hit from deciding to like cave into, like, I'm gonna eat the cupcake. The dopamine hit actually doesn't hit when we do the thing. The dopamine hit actually hits when we decide to do the thing. And so, like, deciding to buy the book, buying the book, and it's not just reading the book, like buying the book, like, that's the thing. Right? I love the point about, man, back in the day, you had to look someone in the eye or not, and buy your self-help book. Because I've long had a hypothesis that one of the reasons why certain authors take off, like we've talked about the Oprah effect, and how Oprah can kind of wave her wand and suddenly it's a bestseller. But it's really common in the self-help section. I think more so than other genres. I think it's fair to say that you'll see the big sticker on there of, like, over 1 billion sold, or like whatever it is. And I think there's a reason. I think that's one of the reasons for that is it's easier to buy a book that's got, like, 1 billion. Come on, everyone's buying this. It was on Oprah.
Yeah, everyone's. Yeah. Right? All my friends have recommended this. Yeah.
I'm not a big loser. I'm curious, right? I saw it on Oprah and I'm one of the 1 billion. Come on, right? Like, I think that's a very specific marketing tactic.
It is. And I've also never understood it, because the thing that self-help books are promising you is that to give you competitive advantage, you as an individual are going to get this tailored advice to have an advantage over all the other lemmings in the world.
Yeah.
Except that you've heard about it on Oprah, as did millions and millions of other people. And so we both want to have this sense that we are unique and part of a crowd. And I guess that's human nature. But it is interesting to see it played out in the self-help space.
Totally.
You bet.
Okay, so we brought up the issue of numbers of books. So I was going to ask, how many self-help books do you think you read per year?
Okay, now can we define read? And
Yeah.
the reason I ask is because do I have to finish the book? Can I listen to some of it? Can I,
Listening is fine. Listening counts as reading in my mind.
Okay.
Do you have to finish it? No, I'd say start. How many self-help books do you start per year?
Oh, yeah. That's going to be a higher number. because every time I go to the bookstore with my kids, I have a routine. I just let them loose in the young adult section and off they go. And I'll be in the self-help aisle,
You bet.
figuring out what's going on in the world of self-help.
Yeah.
Okay. So how many do you pick up with the intention of reading them entirely, or like buy or take out from the library or borrow from a friend?
So anymore, I'll say this.
Anymore, yeah.
Like anymore, that happens a little less often just by virtue of the fact that, I mean, one, I don't have the time that I used to. But two, like at this point, I've read so many, like, again, I was trying to kind of do the math, and I've read in the neighborhood, I think, like if we're going to call reading like most of the way cover to cover, all the way cover to cover, probably 200 at least. Because I tried to make a list, and like this one kind of, I ran out like the 190 something or others. But that doesn't even account for like books I started and abandoned, or I read little bits and pieces of. By the time you get to this point, it's kind of like, that's kind of like asking me how many books I've read on trauma.
Yeah.
Like anymore, I don't read that many books on trauma cover to cover, mostly because I'm experienced enough with both self-help, trauma, what have you, that I can kind of read it. I'm like, okay, I get the gist. Like I know where they're going with this. That said, I still do pick up, like I get books recommended to me all the time. I've got an Audible membership, and Audible is forever recommending like the latest and greatest self-help thing to me. And so, yeah, I would say at least once a month.
Yeah.
Will I start with like, yeah, like that's this month I'm going to polish off Atomic Habits, right? Like this month I'm going to polish off whatever it is.
Wait, that's wild that you should mention that. That's where I was going to. Okay, keep going.
Yeah. So at least once a month. That said, I absolutely engage with self-help stuff that is not mine every single day.
So we've had a couple comments, people asking, actually, Ginny Brown, Seek Safely founder, she's watching. She said, what about religious books like prayer and meditation type books? Would we consider those self-help books?
Yes.
And someone else said, yeah, exactly. Is that considered self-help?
So thank you for that question. It's one of my favorite topics within self-help, because religious self-help books make up 40% of the number of different titles in print in any given year of self-help books. It is the single largest subset of the self-help genre. And yet you do not see religious self-help books on the New York Times bestseller list. Because first, self-help had to be taken off the New York Times nonfiction bestseller list because it was totally monopolizing the whole list. Then after that, the religious self-help books had to be taken off of the self-help list because they would have monopolized the lists. And so now it's this sort of underground, I'd not even say underground, but it's this quiet sort of giant within the industry that are mostly sold at religious bookstores and online now. So yes, I do believe that religious self-help books are self-help. I actually define self-help books as any books that are going to try to give you a prescriptive path to success, happiness, a better life, that are engaged in helping you in a psychological or an emotional way. So, for example, like how to improve your golf swing is not a self-help book, or how to invest in the stock market is not a self-help book, but how to, deepen your faith and find God, or the purpose-driven life, which I believe is in the running for the single number one most popular best-selling self-help book of all time. Although I also note that I think the real number one best-selling self-help book of all time is the Bible.
The Bible. I knew you were going to say that. Yeah.
It's the Bible. I mean, that is definitely that's definitely got to be the case. And once I had sort of thought about that years and years ago, every time I sit in church, I hear the homilies. I mean, it is such a strong self-help message, not only in the readings, but every single homily. So the idea of the therapeutic gospel has paired up with the Judeo-Christian gospels in a big way.
All right. Awesome.
Well, I
Thank
mean,
you for answering their question. Yeah.
like it always reminds me of, like, so those who know me know I love the American Office TV show. And there's an episode where they have to vacate the office because they've had a fire drill. And as they're hanging out outside, they're playing Desert Island, right? Like, if you're on a desert island, what are the 3 books you'd have? Jim asks Angela, so what are the 3 books you'd have on a desert island? And she goes, the Bible. It's like, okay. And then she goes, Purpose-Driven Life. Like, okay, fair. And then he goes, okay, you got 1 more. And she goes, no. Okay. Fantastic. Angela covering the spread. No, one of the splendid source of modern self-help books, you could probably say, is good old Norman Vincent Peale.
Absolutely.
And The Power of Positive Thinking, which is an extraordinary read. It is heavily Christian. But he so deftly weaves it in and out of the just straight up positive thinking kind of standard stuff. But there's also a subset of, you could probably make the argument that the modern self-help book might not even exist if not for the success of that book. It's also the case that there is a subset of super successful self-help books that have religious underpinnings that are not made explicit.
I know where you're going. Yes.
The most famous of this, in my opinion, is The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People.
Absolutely.
Which, if you know what to, and I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing. Like, I think that's a pretty good book. That said, if you know what you're looking for, you can absolutely see Stephen Covey's spiritual underpinnings. With that, and so there's also a subset. Speaking of Nathaniel Branden, there's also a subset of self-help that is really philosophically driven, like more so than like psychologically driven. So Branden, of course, again, having been a lover of Ayn Rand, especially in his early writing when he was like with her and part of her cult, you can really see the overtones. You can really see like he was just kind of peddling objectivist philosophy as kind of a self-help thing. So it's super interesting that, they're like, we did an episode of the GEEK podcast last year about self-help books that are not self-help books, but actually are self-help books. Yeah. So once you know what you're looking for, it's super, super interesting.
And because my parents loved the Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, one of, I believe, the first self-help book that I ever owned, because it was given to me by my parents, was Capitalism for Kids. No joke, folks, no joke. And that's a great example of a philosophy, an economic philosophy, turned into a self-help guidance for how to, have the best lemonade stand in the neighborhood.
It's a really interesting self-help book. We're kind of off topic, but self-help book that isn't a self-help book, but it's a philosophy thing. Barry Goldwater, Republican presidential candidate in 1964, wrote a tiny little book that I happen to have right here, titled "The Conscience of a Conservative," right? And it's this tiny, it's a pamphlet. And it's about exactly what it sounds like. Like it's about conservative political, like it's kind of unrecognized, like now it'd be called libertarian political philosophy. But this book is not just about politics. Like, this book is like how to be a successful human. It's not heavy-handed about it, but it talks a lot about freedom and liberty and the importance to the human condition of like stuff. Like, this is like how to be a better person. But again, it's wrapped up in political philosophy. Super interesting.
Very interesting. I was going to ask favorite obscure self-help book.
Ooh, that's a really good question.
Oh, I mean,
and it could be a self-help.
I know. I have my answer.
Okay, good. All right.
Okay.
Go ahead. I got to think.
Okay. I'm very excited about this one. So, because I also have props for this one.
Ooh, yeah.
Yes.
Yay for props. So when I was single and dating in New York City, there was a book called The Rules. All right. Oh, this is not the obscure one. You know where I'm going with this, Dr. Doyle. Okay. So the rules, it's called Time-Tested Secrets for Capturing the Heart of Mr. Right. Now, this is not an obscure self-help book because all the women of my generation know it. And we followed the rules or didn't follow the rules. You would be called a rules girl. I mean, it was really a thing. And I read this book and reread it. And with one guy I dated, I actually did follow the rules. And that worked right up until I stopped following the rules. And then he was no longer interested because it turns out that the type of man who is interested in this type of woman is not the type of man who's actually interested in me. But I did. But so anyway, so I followed this. And there's a whole separate backstory about this because since the authors of the rules knew that there was going to be this problem that you could capture a man this way, but you would also have to keep him by following similar rules. They had to write the follow-up book about the rules to a happy marriage. But then when one of the authors herself got divorced, it didn't go
Fell apart.
Well. But that's just the backstory to my all-time favorite obscure self-help book. Are you ready for it? It's called The Code. Time-Tested Secrets for Getting What You Want from Women Without Marrying Them. And it is a men's spoof guide to how to sleep with and not marry a rules girl. And it is, the code breaks all the rules. And it's so hilarious. So there are like every sort of bad, so they basically diagram all these women and how to undermine their rulesy craziness with this code. And so that, my friends, is if you ever wanted to do a deep dive into late 90s, early 2000s dating, right here.
God,
That's amazing.
They
I love
presaged they presaged the pickup artist movement by what, 20 years?
20 years. Yeah. Oh no, they were really ahead of the times.
Big time. Because among the most popular self-help books of kind of the mid 2000s, around 2010, 2011, was The Mystery Method and Secrets of Speed Seduction by Ross Jeffries. Glenn, how do you know so much about this? Don't worry about it.
Don't worry about it. Smile.
But that's what it was. Like that. What was the big one? It was The Game by Neil Strauss.
That's the game. Yes, The Game. That was the big one.
You bet. So one of the first self-help books I ever bought as a teenager. There were two of them because I was terribly shy. I still have terrible social anxiety. Both of you have seen me in social settings. You know exactly what I'm talking about. And I was despondent over the idea that a girl would ever like me. And so I purchased one slim little self-help book that it was like How to Flirt, The Smart Guide to Flirting, something like that. I don't even remember what it was. It had really interesting advice. It was like, I remember explicitly one of the pieces of advice was watch old black and white movies where there's love in it. And watch like how their body language and whatever. Like, don't watch modern movies. Like, watch the old black and white movies because they were really good at like subtextual communication and stuff. It's really interesting. But I also bought a book by, I believe the author's name was Ellen Krieger, a book titled Light Her Fire. And I remember getting a chapter in. I'm like, this is above my head. This is for people who already have more game than I ever will. You asked about obscure self-help books.
Yes.
There's one that I really like titled Taming Your Gremlin by Rick Carson. Does this ring a bell?
No, I'm intrigued.
It's the same. It's along the same line. Like if anybody's familiar with Rational Recovery by Jack Trimpey, or the Miracle Cure to Stop Drinking. I think that's the name of the book by Kim Insoo Berg. But I came across Taming Your Gremlin and looking for resources because I'm a recovering addict and kind of looking for resources on that. And he has a whole thing. Rick Carson, he's got YouTube videos that are really, really interesting. He doesn't seem to have a huge audience, which I always found super interesting because Rick Carson has a whole philosophy around gremlin taming. And it's essentially how to wrangle your worst impulses. And it's a set of like super hands-on skills that really speak to emotional regulation in a very direct way. So it's obscure because every time I bring it up, no one knows what I'm talking about. So Taming Your Gremlin by Rick Carson. It's a good one.
That's it's funny because I have this like adorable puppy right now in my life. But when he gets a little tired and crazy and just jumps everywhere and starts biting everything and going insane, we call it gremlin mode. So that sounds like a dog training book right now for me, but
It could go along with another famous self-help book titled Don't Shoot the Dog.
yeah.
Oh man, yes.
By
Can I?
Go ahead.
Yeah. Oh no. Yeah. Well, I was gonna resurrect another old self-help book, which is not obscure. It was not obscure in the time, but I can tell you that nobody thinks about it these days. So for all the women out there, if you would like to find a self-help book that will show you how far gender equality has come, I recommend you pick up The Total Woman. Dr. Doyle, do you know about this book?
I am entirely unfamiliar with either the book or the
Oh
concept.
my heavens. Let's see if my little let's see if my notes, if my things oh, there we go. Okay. So one of the things that you are supposed to do as a wife, first of all, you have to you make dinner as soon as your husband leaves, so that you can take an hour-long bath before he comes home and be relaxed and ready. And after you get out of the bath, one great way to spice up your marriage is to wrap yourself in saran wrap. And greet him at the door wrapped in saran wrap. So this was the #1 best-selling self-help book.
Careful, Christine. I think you might put that back on the bestseller list because it sounds like some trad wife stuff there.
It is totally trad wife stuff.
Saran wrap?
Saran wrap. So by the way, of course, I go really practical on this. And like when I read this in graduate school, I was like, okay, let's just say I wanted to do this. How does one do this? Like, that's a really hard thing to execute.
But what's the
I feel like you need help, and
I would feel like you would need help, and then your husband would wonder who helped you get into the saran wrap. And by the way, how does he get you out of the saran wrap except with like an X-Acto knife? I'm like, this is not okay.
I am so confused. Like, what's the upshot to being wrapped in saran wrap?
That sounds like a sensory nightmare. I totally agree, Lori. I
like,
think
is it supposed to be sexy? Like, is it?
Yes. It's all about being sexy. So the idea, this is all very trad wife stuff. And it's about building up men and embracing your true submissive femininity. But also, oh yes, she ran. So Maribel Morgan, founder and president of the Total Woman Marriage Enrichment Course. She was a former beauty queen, wife of an attorney, mother of 2 young girls. And she went on Phil Donahue, and that's how this became so popular.
That's
that
Oprah
tracks.
before there was Oprah.
Makes a lot of sense.
Anyway, so this is a
rest in peace.
Yeah, the Total Woman is not just a good housekeeper. She's a warm, loving homemaker, not merely a submissive sex partner, a romantic lover. Yeah, it goes on and on and on. So yes, so this one is one of the ones that I think I actually may have been most shocked by this book in my research of 50 years of self-help books. This is the one.
Oh my
that
goodness,
was too much.
That's amazing.
All of that hangs together if you're of that mindset. Like, all that hangs together for me, except
the
saran wrap. I struggle. My girlfriend is watching. Please don't. Okay. The saran wrap. I love
it's
you.
also not very environmentally friendly.
I guess not.
No.
Oh
my gosh, that's ridiculous. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You know what? Okay, so I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Because I was thinking about this. Jean, a few months ago on the podcast, we were making fun of mouth taping.
Yeah.
Remember this? I think it was the podcast where we talked about the masculinity bros.
Yeah.
And all these wellness hacks that kind of sound silly, and who knows if there's whatnot. I have a confession.
Okay.
I'm kind of into mouth taping now.
What is mouth
What
tape?
is the point of it again? I can't even remember.
Okay, so of the recent self-help books I read was a book titled Breathe by James Nestor.
Okay.
And he talks about all the advantages of nose breathing as opposed to mouth breathing.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes into kind of the neurology of it, and it's a really interesting read. And part of what apparently happens, and I'm not an expert on any of this, I'm just going on what the book says. Part of what happens is we go to bed, and for a subset of us, our mouth hangs open and makes us more susceptible to, like, we get terrible sleep, like whatever. If you're breathing through your nose, you get better sleep, you get more oxygen. There's a whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So and he talks about mouth taping, and I'm like, oh my God, we made fun of this on the podcast, and now he's really recommending it. As it turns out, mouth taping is not like,
Mm-hmm.
it's you put vertically like a piece of tape like over your lips. So it's not like you can still breathe out of your mouth if you need to. But what it is, it's just a cue to remember to keep your mouth shut. And at first I'm like, okay, I'm going to try this for a week or two and see, etc. Now I have a hard time sleeping without the mouth tape.
Okay. This
really
is
weird.
perfect. Actually, I had a question about this. So one of my questions was going to be, what is the craziest self-help activity you've participated in? So Dr. Glenn's answer is mouth taping.
Oh, that wouldn't be the answer to that question, but it is. But go on. Yes.
Oh, wait, you got something crazier than that?
I'll tell in a minute. Yeah, but go.
Okay.
Christine, do we have a craziest, or perhaps one we'd be surprised to hear that you tried, or
one of the things that so I am married to a depression researcher. So I'm like the happiness and self-help chick, and I'm married to a depression researcher. I'm married to, and he's a psychiatrist.
That actually just makes so much sense. It's perfect.
Right, it does. And all of our children are somewhat cursed, because it's going to be very hard for all of them to find a therapist one day, because boy, can they talk the talk.
You have my number. You have my number.
That's right. They're going to really need to unpack this childhood. But because of his research, he's very interested in novel treatments for depression. So, and I think some of them are very much in the self-help space, because they are these, these sort of interesting things. So one of the things that he studies is cold plunges.
Yes. Yes.
And so over the summer, so he's done this a bunch, but over the summer, I actually put myself in basically freezing water that was coming right off of a mountaintop, just melted snow right off of a mountain. And oh my gosh, the euphoria when I got out of that water was crazy. So I was kind of interested in that. And then there are everything from like experiments to try to sort of change your microbiome, to psychedelics, to like, there are all these various sort of treatment modalities that are out there around this. And I think they're both interesting. And anytime you're pushing the envelope of what is safe, you've got to be very careful. So, I mean, I think this really, I think this is so crazy experiential self-help, especially in a group setting, always pings a little warning bell for me, because I worry about, about where it could go.
Yeah. I also, it's funny. I have actually a little WhatsApp group with some friends who are regularly doing cold plunges, like just in like a lake kind of thing, going off early in the morning. And I've been wanting to go, because I have also read some things about cold plunging, and I actually love doing the kind of like Finnish bath, kind of like jump in the cold, then go in the warm type stuff. I think one of the other things that is kind of good to consider when we think about doing these sorts of things is, for one thing, whenever I read about it, it's always like, it's going to solve this thing, this thing, this thing, this thing. And it lists all these things, like it's going to fix all these problems. And I'm like, okay, well, it's probably not going to fix everything, but it might be like useful for one or two of these. So just being wary of when it's over promising. And then also, like you said, like just being aware of the fact that, it could be a bit dangerous. So you need to make sure you're doing it in a safe setting. And I think that's true of a lot of these things, in psychedelics included, and some of this other stuff where it's probably okay. It could be harmless if you're doing it in a safe way, but you just have to be aware of that setting. So yeah.
So this is the point where I can tell you all that I've taken cold showers every day since 2018, I think.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
It started as, I didn't even think of that in terms of a crazy self-help thing, but I guess, because for me, I actually didn't learn about it in the self-help literature. I learned about it again in addiction recovery groups. I'm a recovering opiate addict, and that has really done a number on a lot of my sensory stuff. So for example, I can rarely, here's a fun fact about the doc. I can rarely sleep a full night in a soft bed. I have to at some point get on the floor and sleep because I need that hard, like otherwise my restless leg stuff as a direct result of my opiate abuse. But one thing that I have found enormously helpful is in cold showers. It helps enormously. And you're right, it gives a little buzz. Now it might be just I'm an addict and I like the buzz, maybe. But the craziest self-help thing that I think I've ever done comes out of, we're back to all roads lead back to Tony Robbins.
Okay, I have another question about that, but you answer this first.
In Unlimited Power, Tony rips off a whole Tony is heavily influenced by Harvey and Marilyn Diamond's I think Diet for a New America, I think is the original book. But he talks about the importance of water-rich foods, which are fresh fruits and vegetables. And he makes this recommendation that's at least 70% of your diet should be water-rich foods. So as a junior in high school, and again, desperately depressed, self-harming, like the whole thing, I'm like, this is going to fix me. I'm going to do it. And I told my parents, I'm like, 70% of my diet needs to be water-rich foods. And my parents go, whatever, he's doing one of his things. Fine. If you suddenly go from the standard American diet, and this is long before I was a vegetarian, if you suddenly go from the standard American diet to suddenly 70% of your diet being, by the way, I don't know why the water in fruits and vegetables is better than the water you drink, or is different than the water you drink, but Tony swears it is. He also swears that food has megahertz, but we'll get into that some other time. But if you go from a normal diet to one that is high in fresh fruits and vegetables, that does really interesting things to your digestive tract.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I won't get graphic here, but that phase lasted. I gave it a good shot. I was drinking lots of Snapple and eating lots of fruits. But here's the thing, like there weren't that many fruit. I grew up in Des Moines, Iowa. It's not like you get like a wide variety of, so lots of apples. I don't know if you eat like a bunch of apples every day, that does things to your insides.
There's a lot of fiber in there.
Things.
So I kind of consider that maybe
that's
one of the crazier ones. Okay, so on the topic of Tony Robbins, I'm going to get a little more serious here. So we had a comment from our one of our Instagram viewers just saying, I'm pretty disappointed that Robbins was recommended in here. Pretty gross. So I think this, the viewer is referring to the fact that there have been multiple allegations against Tony Robbins of sexual impropriety, both with staff and with customer participants at his events. So I'll say, for one, we're talking about some of these things not necessarily as recommendations, just in terms of things that are influential and have been influential in the self-help industry throughout the years. So I think we can't really leave Tony Robbins out of that conversation. But then I guess this brings up a question for people. Unfortunately, I mean, we see this a lot. Like you have somebody, you read a book, you find a resource, and then you find out soon thereafter that for whatever reason, that guru has really let you down or not lived up to their promise. So what advice do you have for people with what to do with this situation when you've gained something positive for you from a self-help resource, but then, there's something there that's problematic and you're trying to reconcile these two things?
You bet. And I can speak really directly to that. Tony's a scumbag, and I have no problem saying that. If you're going to buy or investigate any product of his, I highly recommend get it at a thrift store, get it someplace where you're not giving Tony Robbins your money. We did actually 2 episodes of the Seek Safely podcast all about this, all about Tony and his influence, and the accusations against him and stuff. So there's no universe in which I'm going to tell people to get involved in the Tony Robbins ecosphere. I also think that Tony has not been Tony. I don't know him, but I also don't think that he has been sufficiently. Again, it's not a matter of being canceled. Like it's a matter of I think that he can have a far more serious conversation about these allegations than he has had. Like the things I've read and heard from him have been really disappointing. They've been really defensive. They've been kind of gaslighty, in my opinion. So let's be super clear. Tony's a scumbag. That said, a lot of these guys are scumbags.
Yes.
A lot of these guys are super problematic. That doesn't necessarily mean that what they write in books and stuff, can't necessarily have a positive impact on your life. That said, there's a really fine line between where their scumbaggery kind of worms its way into their teachings. So, for example, the books that we were talking about, Notes from a Friend and Awaken the Giant Within, again, he steals so much stuff from other people that it's very little of him in there. And it's actually a really good introduction to some things like NLP and neuroassociative conditioning, these kinds of things. Now, his most recent stuff, like his latest book, I think is about energy, if I'm not mistaken. I haven't read it cover to cover, but you can see the influence of some of kind of the conspirituality that he's gotten into. He was a big time COVID denier. Like he was a big time vaccine skeptic.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would be really, really wary of especially latter day Tony Robbins. But my point is, no, there is some nuance in terms of at least some of the early stuff. But I want to be very, very emphatic. He's a scumbag.
There was a wonderful academic article, one of the very few academic articles written about the self-help industry, about self-help reading as a thin culture. And what this Professor Lichterman, who wrote the article, was arguing was that self-help consumers are fairly smart. They pick and choose what lessons they want to take from each self-help book. And so part of seeking safely is the ability to pick and choose the elements that resonate with what you need at the time, rather than following a guru wherever he leads. And so that is really where the self-help and the cult world kind of separate. And so in this case, I think it is a good thing. We joke that people don't get past chapter 3. Sometimes it's best to not get past chapter 3. And buyer beware on so many of these things. If it has the power to help you, it may also have the power to harm you. So I think it's a very good point to raise. And while we're being lighthearted about a lot of these self-help books, there are many books that have harmed people and have led people in very difficult directions that have also been bestsellers. And some of Tony Robbins' books may be among them. So
just to kind of put a button on this conversation on this subject. Speaking of scumbags who can sometimes offer useful ideas, our old friend James Arthur Ray. One of the reasons why Seek Safely exists. He's a scumbag. He's also a minister these days. Jean, did you see that?
I'm curious about that. Yeah.
James.
Curious.
James changed his Twitter bio to include minister. God bless him. Anyway, scumbag, bad guy. his bestseller book, Harmonic Wealth, offers some interesting ideas. A lot of them are cribbed from other sources, as in the grand tradition.
Mhm.
But his idea of harmony, like he talks about harmonic wealth, I think that's a really interesting and useful metaphor that can really be used. So again, there's a whole conversation we can have about separating the art from the artist. What I can say is I don't recommend giving any of these guys money. The good news is if you've been to a thrift store, you know that one of the things you can absolutely do is pick up self-help books for $0.25.
It's true. Yeah.
Do that.
That's true.
Do that.
That is true.
All right. Well, thank you guys for addressing that. I think we actually have lost our Instagram audience now because it's capped at an hour.
Oh no.
Yeah. That's okay. We still have Facebook and YouTube watchers. But I will wrap us up. So my final question for you is, if you were going to start a self-help book club, what are the first 3 books that you would roll with?
Whew.
How do
we should start a self-help book club.
We
actually.
totally should. Okay, so how to win friends and influence people.
Okay.
The road less traveled.
Yeah.
And then if I could run the book club such that I could make sure that people wouldn't go off the rails with it, I might give, in fact, my least favorite self-help book of all time to discuss why it was so persuasive in the culture and how to combat the misinformation in secret.
Yes,
And The
I knew you were
Secret.
going to say The Secret. I knew it. Okay,
The Secret is always the one that and I tried to teach it in my college classes and tried to get the students to think critically about it, but it is such a damn powerful idea that all of them wrote essays about how it changed their lives and how they
seductive, so seductive, as they say.
It's so seductive. So yes, those are my off the cuff top 3.
I love it. And you know what? It's like sometimes the bad book makes the best book club book.
Yes.
Because it can generate really good conversation. So there you go.
So maybe it's useful to divide it up then.
Yes.
With like so for the 3 books that you'd lead off with in a self-help book club, a bad book, like a good book or an interesting book, and a useful book.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe. So, okay. So my useful book is a self-help book I think everybody should read. I'm sure I've recommended it a dozen times. It's called The Memory Book by Harry Lorraine and Jerry Lucas.
I bought that just because you recommended it.
It's one of the most useful books, most practically useful. It's about trained memory techniques. And as a kid with ADHD, it saved my hide when it came to, there you go, right there. So that's the useful one. The interesting one, since Christine already said The Road Less Traveled, I think everybody should read The Road Less Traveled. Again, I would go to a different book by M. Scott Peck that I found just endlessly fascinating. It's called In Search of Stones. And he talks about a trip that he and his then wife took to England, Ireland, that area, Scotland, right, to go on this tour of these ancient monolith stones. And he weaves his journey to the stones in between reflections on life and spirituality and children and whatnot. And it's endlessly fascinating. I think it'll make a great conversation piece for any book club.
Given that one of my kids is named after standing stones, I feel like I have to read that book, actually.
You bet. In Search of Stones is really good. And for a bad self-help book that we can just read for the lulls, there's a book that annoys the hell out of me called What to Say When You Talk to Yourself by Shad Helmstetter. This book had a moment in, I feel like, the early 2000s. And look, its premise is sound. Like if you follow my work, like that I think self-talk is one of our three most effective tools of emotional regulation, right? Self-talk matters. And Chad Helmstetter decided to take that one sentence that I just said, self-help or self-talk matters, and he extended it over 200 pages and they never taught you how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
It gets to the very end. It's similar, and I'm similarly frustrated by a book by Martin Seligman, the psychologist, called Learned Optimism.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Where Seligman was a researcher. He actually kind of coined I don't know if he coined the term or did a lot of the research or whatever about learned helplessness. And he decided to write a self-help book. Says, here's how you counter learned helplessness with learned optimism. And he talks a lot about the research about how to be more optimistic, or not how to be more optimistic, but like the benefits of being more optimistic and the research, et cetera, et cetera. And then you get to the end, you're like, okay, wait a minute, how do I do it? And he's got nothing. I hate books like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So those would be good, bad self-help books to talk about in a self-help book club.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right, perfect. Well, I'm going to put the master list together of all the books because we had a few people ask for links to some of the books you mentioned. So
yes.
I did share a link for The Road Less Traveled. But yeah, I can share some of these other ones as well.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And we have a question. Isn't Seligman the founder of positive intelligence?
Positive psychology, yes.
Positive psychology,
yeah.
Yes.
You bet.
Yes, he is. Yeah. Yes, he is.
All right. Well, I'm so grateful to both of you for sharing your self-help geekery with us. It's always a good time, and it's always just kind of fascinating to dive into your brains about the self-help world.
Well, thank you, Jean, for bringing this all together and for allowing me to, line up
to show your stack.
My stack of self-help. This is just a small part of the huge library.
Exactly.
This night on GEEK Week last year, and again tonight, and whenever we have Christine, whenever we have you on our podcast, these are my favorite conversations.
Yeah, we really get to go full geek mode.
I love it.
Geek mode.
You don't understand. For years, I was the only, like on the GEEK board, I was like the only one in the room who like had any kind of a positive association with the genre. Right. So to have you aboard and to talk about and be knowledgeable about these things has been a real treat and a real pleasure. And we get to pick your brain again tomorrow night.
Mm-hmm.
What's coming up tomorrow night, Jean?
Yes. So tomorrow night is Ask the Doc, which was a very popular night last year as well. So I'm going to be posting to solicit questions from our listeners and our supporters. Any kinds of questions related to, for Dr. Doyle, you might have questions about trauma or recovery or other psychological related questions for Dr. Christine, who is the happiness and purpose professor. You may also have some questions for Dr. Whelan as well. So we're going to be soliciting your questions, and then we will jump into it tomorrow. Same time, 8 p.m. Eastern time, and we're on Instagram for an hour, YouTube and Facebook. We'll try to keep it under an hour tomorrow. I don't know. It's tough. We could keep going. And then, of course, this is our annual fundraiser. So if you are able, we are very grateful for your support. I'm going to show the little banner there. You can donate at seeksafely.org and hit the donate now button. We also have fundraisers on Facebook, and we'll put some fundraisers on Instagram as well. We appreciate everyone's support so that we can keep doing this work of protecting and empowering self-help seekers and trying to improve this industry from within, and with our legislative effort as well. So thank you. Thank you to everyone who supports us. And thank you to both of you.
If you're watching this in about 10 or 15 minutes, we will hit it up on the Dr. Glenn Patrick Doyle page for the after party. We'll read some blogs. Maybe we'll talk about music. We'll see what happens. But head on over. Love to see you. Hello,
Awesome.
Abbey Road. How are you?
All right. Thanks so much, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow.
Later, Tater.
Bye-bye.
Bye.